Finding Joanne and Mona. When Jobs was 31, a year after his ouster from Apple, his mother, Clara, who was a smoker, was stricken with lung cancer. He spent time by her deathbed, talking to her in ways he had rarely done in the past, and asking some questions he had refrained from raising before. "When you and Dad got married, were you a virgin?" he asked. It was hard for her to talk, but she forced a smile. That's when she told him that she had been married before, to a man who never made it back from the war. She also filled in some of the details of how she and Paul Jobs had come to adopt him. Soon after that, Jobs succeeded in tracking down the woman who had put him up for adoption. His quiet quest to find her had begun in the early 1980s, when he hired a detective who had failed to come up with anything. Then Jobs noticed the name of a San Francisco doctor on his birth certificate. He was in the phone book, so I gave him a call, Jobs recalled. The doctor was no help. He claimed that his records had been destroyed in a fire. That was not true. In fact, right after Jobs called, the doctor wrote a letter, sealed it in an envelope, and wrote on it, "To be delivered to Steve Jobs on my death." When he died a short time later, his widow sent the letter to Jobs. In it, the doctor explained that his mother had been an unmarried graduate student from Wisconsin named Joanne Schabel. It took another few weeks and the work of another detective to track her down. After giving him up, Joanne had married his biological father, Abdul Fattah John Jandali, and they had another child, Mona. Jandali abandoned them 5 years later, and Joanne married a colorful ice skating instructor, George Simpson. That marriage didn't last long either, and in 1970 she began a meandering journey that took her and Mona, both of them now using the last name Simpson, to Los Angeles. Jobs had been reluctant to let Paul and Clara, whom he considered his real parents, know about his search for his birth mother. When Clara died, he decided to tell Paul Jobs, who was perfectly comfortable, and said he didn't mind at all if Steve made contact with his biological mother. So one day Jobs called Joanne Simpson, said who he was, and arranged to come down to Los Angeles to meet her. "I wanted to meet my biological mother mostly to see if she was okay, and to thank her, because I'm glad I didn't end up as an abortion. She was 23, and she went through a lot to have me." Joanne was overcome with emotion when Jobs arrived at her Los Angeles house. She knew he was famous and rich, but she wasn't exactly sure why. She apologized over and over, even as Jobs kept reassuring her that he understood and that things had turned out just fine. Once she calmed down, she told Jobs that he had a full sister, Mona Simpson, who was then an aspiring novelist in Manhattan. She had never told Mona that she had a brother, and that day she broke the news, or at least part of it, by telephone. "You have a brother, and he's wonderful, and he's famous, and I'm going to bring him to New York so you can meet him," she said. The meeting occurred in the lobby of the St. Regis Hotel. "He was totally straightforward and lovely, just a normal and sweet guy," Mona recalled. They all sat and talked for a few minutes. Then he took his sister for a long walk, just the two of them. Jobs was thrilled to find that he had a sibling who was so similar to him. They were both intense in their artistry, observant of their surroundings, and sensitive yet strong-willed. "My sister's a writer," he exulted to colleagues at Apple when he found out. Mona was not completely thrilled at first to have me in her life and have her mother so emotionally affectionate toward me, he later said. "As we got to know each other, we became really good friends, and she is my family." The Lost Father. In the meantime, Mona Simpson had been trying to track down their father, who had wandered off when she was 5. Then she met a private eye in California who was able to find an address for Abdul Fattah Jandali in Sacramento through a Department of Motor Vehicles search. Jobs had no interest in meeting him. "He didn't treat me well," he later explained. "I don't hold anything against him. I'm happy to be alive. But what bothers me most is that he didn't treat Mona well. He abandoned her." Simpson went to Sacramento alone. "It was very intense," Simpson recalled. She found her father working in a small restaurant. He seemed happy to see her, yet oddly passive about the entire situation. They talked for a few hours, and he recounted that after he left Wisconsin, he had drifted away from teaching and gotten into the restaurant business. Jobs had asked Simpson not to mention him, so she didn't. But at one point, her father casually remarked that he and her mother had had another baby, a boy, before she had been born. "What happened to him?" she asked. He replied, "We'll never see that baby again. That baby's gone." Simpson recoiled, but said nothing. An even more astonishing revelation occurred when Jandali was describing the previous restaurants that he had run. There had been some nice ones, he insisted, fancier than the Sacramento joint they were then sitting in. He told her somewhat emotionally that he wished she could have seen him when he was managing a Mediterranean restaurant north of San Jose. "That was a wonderful place," he said. "All of the successful technology people used to come there, even Steve Jobs." Simpson was stunned. "Oh yeah, he used to come in, and he was a sweet guy and a big tipper," her father added. Mona was able to refrain from blurting out, "Steve Jobs is your son." When the visit was over, she called Jobs surreptitiously from the payphone at the restaurant and arranged to meet him at the Espresso Roma Cafe in Berkeley. Jobs was understandably astonished when she mentioned the restaurant near San Jose. He could recall being there and even meeting the man who was his biological father. "It was amazing," he later said of the revelation. "I had been to that restaurant a few times, and I remember meeting the owner. He was Syrian, balding. We shook hands." Nevertheless, Jobs still had no desire to see him. "I was a wealthy man by then, and I didn't trust him not to try to blackmail me or go to the press about it," he recalled. "I asked Mona not to tell him about me." She never did. But years later, Jandali saw his relationship to Jobs mentioned online. "What is this thing about Steve Jobs?" he asked Mona. She confirmed the story, but added that she thought Jobs had no interest in meeting him. Jandali seemed to accept that. "My father is thoughtful and a beautiful storyteller, but he is very, very passive," Simpson said. He never contacted Steve. Jobs did retain a friendly relationship with his biological mother, Joanne Simpson. Over the years, she and Mona would often spend Christmas at Jobs's house. The visits could be sweet, but also emotionally draining. Joanne would sometimes break into tears, say how much she had loved him, and apologize for giving him up. As he told her one Christmas, "Don't worry, I had a great childhood. I turned out okay." Lisa. Lisa Brennan, however, did not have a great childhood. When she was young, her father almost never came to see her. "I didn't want to be a father, so I wasn't," Jobs later said, with only a touch of remorse in his voice. Yet occasionally he felt the tug. By the time Lisa turned 8 in 1986, his visits were occurring more frequently. Lisa soon became interested enough that he would take walks with her. He would also go rollerblading with her on the quiet streets of old Palo Alto. But it was not always sweetness and light. Jobs was as mercurial with Lisa as he was with almost everyone, cycling between embrace and abandonment. Lisa learned to be temperamental in return. Over the years, their relationship would be a roller coaster, with each of the low points elongated by their shared stubbornness. After a falling out, they could go for months not speaking to each other. the romantic. When it came to women, Jobs could be deeply romantic. He tended to fall in love dramatically, share with friends every up and down of a relationship, and pine in public whenever he was away from his current girlfriend. Just as the turmoil with Scully was beginning to build at Apple in early 1985, Jobs was heading to a meeting when he stopped at the office of a guy who was working with the Apple Foundation, which helped get computers to nonprofit organizations. Sitting in his office was a lithe, very blonde woman who combined a hippie aura of natural purity with the solid sensibilities of a computer consultant. Her name was Tina Redsea. She was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, Jobs recalled. He called her the next day and asked her to dinner. She said no, that she was living with a boyfriend. A few days later, he took her on a walk to a nearby park and again asked her out, and this time she told her boyfriend that she wanted to go. Within a few months, she had moved into the unfurnished mansion in Woodside. She was the first person I was truly in love with, Jobs later said. We had a very deep connection. I don't know that anyone will ever understand me better than she did. Redsea came from a troubled family, and Jobs shared with her his own pain about being put up for adoption. We were both wounded from our childhood, Redsea recalled. He said to me that we were misfits, which is why we belong together. When he was being eased out at Apple in 1985, Redsea traveled with him in Europe, where he was salving his wounds. Standing on a bridge over the Seine one evening, they bandied about the idea, more romantic than serious, of just staying in France, maybe settling down, perhaps indefinitely. Redsea was eager, but Jobs didn't want to. He was burned, but still ambitious. I am a reflection of what I do, he told her. She recalled their Paris moment in a poignant email she sent to him 25 years later. We were on a bridge in Paris in the summer of 1985. It was overcast. We leaned against the smooth stone rail and stared at the green water rolling on below. Your world had cleaved, and then it paused, waiting to rearrange itself around whatever you chose next. I wanted to run away from what had come before. I tried to convince you to begin a new life with me in Paris, to shed our former selves and let something else course through us. The relationship lurched up and down for 5 years. Caring deeply about someone who seemed incapable of caring was a particular kind of hell that she wouldn't wish on anyone, she said. When they were together for a long stretch, things did not work out well. But when they were apart, Jobs would pine for her. Finally, in the summer of 1989, he asked her to marry him. She couldn't do it. It would drive her crazy, she told friends. I could not have been a good wife to Steve Jobs, the icon, she later explained. I would have sucked at it on many levels. In our personal interactions, I couldn't abide his unkindness. I didn't want to hurt him, yet I didn't want to stand by and watch him hurt other people either. It was painful and exhausting. Redsea later married, had 2 children, and then divorced. Every now and then Jobs would openly pine for her, even after he was happily married, and when he began his battle with cancer, she got in touch again to give support. Jobs suddenly started to cry one afternoon as he sat in his living room reminiscing about her. She was one of the purest people I've ever known, he said, tears rolling down his cheeks. There was something spiritual about her, and spiritual about the connection we had. He said he always regretted that they could not make it work, and he knew that she had such regrets as well, but it was not meant to be. On that, they both agreed. Family Man. At Home with the Jobs Clan. Laureen Powell. By this point, based on his dating history, a matchmaker could have put together a composite sketch of the woman who would be right for Jobs. Smart, yet unpretentious. Tough enough to stand up to him, yet zen-like enough to rise above turmoil. Well-educated and independent, yet ready to make accommodations for him and a family. Down to earth, but with a touch of the ethereal. Savvy enough to know how to manage him, but secure enough to not always need to. And it wouldn't hurt to be a beautiful, lanky blonde with an easygoing sense of humor who liked organic vegetarian food. In October 1989, after his split with Tina Redsea, just such a woman walked into his life. More specifically, just such a woman walked into his classroom. Jobs had agreed to give one of the View from the Top lectures at the Stanford Business School one Thursday evening. Laureen Powell was a new graduate student at the business school, and a guy in her class talked her into going to the lecture. They arrived late, and all the seats were taken, so they sat in the aisle. When an usher told them they had to move, Powell took her friend down to the front row and commandeered 2 of the reserved seats there. Jobs was led to the one next to her when he arrived. I looked to my right, and there was a beautiful girl there, so we started chatting while I was waiting to be introduced, Jobs recalled. They bantered a bit, and Laureen joked that she was sitting there because she had won a raffle, and the prize was that he got to take her to dinner. He was so adorable, she later said. After the speech, Jobs hung around on the edge of the stage chatting with students. He watched Powell leave, then come back and stand at the edge of the crowd, then leave again. He bolted out after her, brushing past the dean who was trying to grab him for a conversation. After catching up with her in the parking lot, he said, "Excuse me, wasn't there something about a raffle you won that I'm supposed to take you to dinner?" She laughed. "How about Saturday?" he asked. She agreed and wrote down her number. Jobs headed to his car to drive up to the Thomas Fogarty Winery in the Santa Cruz Mountains above Woodside, where the Next Education Sales Group was holding a dinner. But he suddenly stopped and turned around. I thought, wow, I'd rather have dinner with her than the education group, so I ran back to her car and said, "How about dinner tonight?" She said yes. It was a beautiful fall evening, and they walked into Palo Alto to a funky vegetarian restaurant, St. Michael's Alley, and ended up staying there for 4 hours. "We've been together ever since," he said. There were only 2 women in my life that I was truly in love with, Tina and Laureen, Jobs later said. I thought I was in love with Joan Baez, but I really just liked her a lot. It was just Tina, and then Laureen. Laureen Powell had been born in New Jersey in 1963 and had learned to be self-sufficient at an early age. Her father was a Marine Corps pilot who died a hero in a crash in Santa Ana, California. He had been leading a crippled plane in for a landing, and when it hit his plane, he kept flying to avoid a residential area rather than ejecting in time to save his life. Her mother's second marriage turned out to be a horrible situation, but she felt she couldn't leave because she had no means to support her large family. The lesson I learned was clear, that I always wanted to be self-sufficient, she said. I took pride in that. My relationship with money is that it's a tool to be self-sufficient, but it's not something that is part of who I am. After their Thursday night dinner, she invited Jobs over to her Palo Alto apartment on Saturday. Her close friend, Catherine "Cat" Smith, drove down from Berkeley and pretended to be her roommate so she could meet him as well. She recalled that their relationship became very passionate. They would kiss and make out, Smith said. He was enraptured with her. He would call me on the phone and ask, "What do you think? Does she like me?" Here I am in this bizarre position of having this iconic person call me. That New Year's Eve of 1989, the 3 went to Chez Panisse, the famed Alice Waters restaurant in Berkeley, along with Lisa, then 11. Something happened at the dinner that caused Jobs and Powell to start arguing. They left separately, and Powell ended up spending the night at Cat Smith's apartment. At 9 the next morning, there was a knock at the door, and Smith opened it to find Jobs standing in the drizzle, holding some wildflowers he had picked. "May I come in and see Lorene?" he said. She was still asleep, and he walked into the bedroom. A couple of hours went by, while Smith waited in the living room, unable to go in and get her clothes. Finally, she put a coat on over her nightgown and went to Pete's Coffee to pick up some food. Jobs did not emerge until after noon. "Cat, can you come here for a minute?" he asked. They all gathered in the bedroom. "As you know, Lorene's father passed away, and Lorene's mother isn't here, and since you're her best friend, I'm going to ask you the question," he said. "I'd like to marry Lorene. Will you give your blessing?" Smith clambered onto the bed and thought about it. "Is this okay with you?" she asked Powell. When she nodded yes, Smith announced, "Well, there's your answer." It was not, however, a definitive answer. Jobs had a way of focusing on something with insane intensity for a while and then abruptly turning away his gaze. In the mornings at his woodside mansion, he would wake Powell up by blasting the Fine Young Cannibals' "She Drives Me Crazy" on his tape deck. Yet at other times he would ignore her. Once she had accepted his marriage proposal on the first day of 1990, he didn't mention it again for several months. In September, she became fed up with waiting and moved out. The following month, he gave her a diamond engagement ring, and she moved back in. In December, Jobs took Powell to his favorite vacation spot, Kona Village in Hawaii. The night before Christmas, he again declared, even more formally, that he wanted to marry her. Soon another factor would drive that decision. While in Hawaii, Powell got pregnant. "We know exactly where it happened," Jobs later said with a laugh. Jobs again began balking at the idea of marriage. Powell's pregnancy did not completely settle the issue. Furious, she moved out of his house and back to her apartment. He ended up making the right choice. Even though he would pine about the spiritual nature of his connection to Redsea, he had a far more solid relationship with Powell. Powell had fair warning of what she was getting into. As she was planning the wedding, the person who was going to do the calligraphy for the invitations came by the house to show them some options. There was no furniture for her to sit on, so she sat on the floor and laid out the samples. Jobs looked for a few minutes, then got up and left the room. They waited for him to come back, but he didn't. After a while, Powell went to find him in his room. "Get rid of her," he said. "I can't look at her stuff. It's shit." On March 18, 1991, Stephen Paul Jobs, 36, married Lorene Powell, 27, at the Ahwahnee Lodge in Yosemite National Park. About 50 people came, including Steve's father, Paul Jobs, and sister Mona Simpson. The ceremony was in the solarium, with the snow coming down hard and Glacier Point just visible in the distance. It was conducted by Jobs's longtime Soto Zen teacher, Kobun Chino, who shook a stick, struck a gong, lit incense, and chanted in a mumbling manner that most guests found incomprehensible. The wedding cake was in the shape of Half Dome, the granite crest at the end of Yosemite Valley, but since it was strictly vegan, devoid of eggs, milk, or any refined products, more than a few of the guests found it inedible. Afterward, they all went hiking, and Powell's 3 strapping brothers launched a snowball fight with lots of tackling and roughhousing. "You see, Mona," Jobs said to his sister, "Lorene is descended from Joe Namath, and we're descended from John Muir." Instead of living in the isolated and rather spooky, unfurnished Woodside mansion, the couple moved into a charming and unpretentious house on a corner in a family-friendly neighborhood in old Palo Alto. "We wanted to live in a neighborhood where kids could walk to see friends," Jobs later said. Jobs had never furnished his Woodside house beyond a few bare essentials. Now that he was living in a normal neighborhood home with a wife and soon a child, he had to make some concessions to necessity. But it was hard. They got beds, dressers, and a music system for the living room, but items like sofas took longer. "We spoke about furniture in theory for 8 years, recalled Powell. "We spent a lot of time asking ourselves, what is the purpose of a sofa?" The house was so unassuming that Bill Gates was somewhat baffled when he visited with his wife. "Do all of you live here?" asked Gates, who was then in the process of building a 66,000-square-foot mansion near Seattle. Even when he had his second coming at Apple and was a world-famous billionaire, Jobs had no security guards or live-in servants, and he even kept the back door unlocked during the day. Jobs kept his mansion in Woodside, about 10 miles up into the mountains from Palo Alto. When Bill Clinton was president, he and Hillary Clinton stayed in the 1950s ranch house on the property on their visits to their daughter, who was at Stanford. Since both the main house and ranch house were unfurnished, Powell would call furniture and art dealers when the Clintons were coming and pay them to furnish the houses temporarily. Once, shortly after the Monica Lewinsky flurry broke, Powell was making a final inspection of the furnishings and noticed that one of the paintings was missing. Worried, she asked the advance team and Secret Service what had happened. One of them pulled her aside and explained that it was a painting of a dress on a hanger, and given the issue of the blue dress in the Lewinsky matter, they had decided to hide it. During one of his late-night phone conversations with Jobs, Clinton asked how he should handle the Lewinsky issue. "I don't know if you did it, but if so, you've got to tell the country," Jobs told the president. There was silence on the other end of the line. Lisa moves in. In the middle of Lisa's 8th grade year, her teachers called Jobs. There were serious problems, and it was probably best for her to move out of her mother's house. So Jobs went on a walk with Lisa, asked about the situation, and offered to let her move in with him. She was a mature girl, just turning 14, and she thought about it for 2 days, then she said yes. She already knew which room she wanted, the one right next to her father's. When she was there once with no one home, she had tested it out by lying down on the bare floor. It was a tough period. Chrisanne Brennan would sometimes walk over from her own house a few blocks away and yell at them from the yard. Lisa lived with Jobs and Powell for all 4 of her years at Palo Alto High School, and she began using the name Lisa Brennan Jobs. She applied to Harvard, forging her father's signature on the application because he was out of town, and was accepted for the class entering in 1996. When she would come home, fights over small things, what was being served for dinner, whether she was paying enough attention to her half-siblings, would blow up, and they would not speak to each other for weeks and sometimes months. Jobs did not go to Lisa's Harvard graduation in 2000. "She didn't even invite me," he says. Jobs' ups and downs with Lisa continued after she moved to Manhattan as a freelance writer. Their problems were exacerbated because of Jobs' frustrations with Chrisanne. He had bought a $700,000 house for Chrisanne to use and put it in Lisa's name, but Chrisanne convinced her to sign it over and then sold it, using the money to travel with a spiritual advisor and to live in Paris. When Chrisanne needed money for a bad sinus infection and dental problem, Jobs refused to give it to her, causing Lisa again to not speak to him for a few years, and thus the pattern would continue. Children. When Powell gave birth in 1991, a few months after her wedding to Jobs, their child was known for 2 weeks as Baby Boy Jobs, because settling on a name was proving only slightly less difficult than choosing a washing machine. Finally, they named him Reed Paul Jobs. His middle name was that of Jobs's father, and his first name, both Jobs and Powell insist, was chosen because it sounded good rather than because it was the name of Jobs's college. Reed turned out to be like his father in many ways, incisive and smart, with intense eyes and a mesmerizing charm. But unlike his father, he had sweet manners and a self-effacing grace. Erin Sienna Jobs was born in 1995. She was a little quieter and sometimes suffered from not getting much of her father's attention. The youngest child, Eve, was born in 1998, and she turned into a strong-willed, funny firecracker who, neither needy nor intimidated, knew how to handle her father, negotiate with him, and sometimes win, and even make fun of him. Her father joked that she's the one who will run Apple someday if she doesn't become president of the United States. Jobs developed a strong relationship with Reed, but with his daughters he was more distant. In 1995, Oracle's CEO, Larry Ellison, threw a 40th birthday party for Jobs filled with tech stars and moguls. He had become a close friend, and he would often take the Jobs family out on one of his many luxurious yachts. Reed started referring to him as our rich friend, which was amusing evidence of how his father refrained from ostentatious displays of wealth. The lesson Jobs learned from his Buddhist days was that material possessions often cluttered life rather than enriched it. Every other CEO I know has a security detail, he said. They've even got them at their homes. It's a nutso way to live. We just decided that's not how we wanted to raise our kids. Toy Story. Buzz and Woody to the rescue. It's kind of fun to do the impossible, Walt Disney once said. That was the type of attitude that appealed to Jobs. He admired Disney's obsession with detail and design, and he felt that there was a natural fit between Pixar and the movie studio that Disney had founded. The Walt Disney Company had licensed Pixar's computer animation production system, and that made it the largest customer for Pixar's computers. One day, Jeffrey Katzenberg, the head of Disney's film division, invited Jobs down to the Burbank studios to see the technology in operation. As the Disney folks were showing him around, Jobs turned to Katzenberg and asked, "Is Disney happy with Pixar?" With great exuberance, Katzenberg answered yes. Then Jobs asked, "Do you think we at Pixar are happy with Disney?" Katzenberg said he assumed so. "No, we're not," Jobs said. "We want to do a film with you. That would make us happy." Katzenberg was willing. The idea that John Lasseter pitched was called Toy Story. It sprang from a belief, which he and Jobs shared, that products have an essence to them, a purpose for which they were made. If the object were to have feelings, these would be based on its desire to fulfill its essence. The purpose of a glass, for example, is to hold water. If it had feelings, it would be happy when full and sad when empty. The essence of a computer screen is to interface with a human. As for toys, their purpose is to be played with by kids, and thus their existential fear is of being discarded or upstaged by newer toys. As the film progressed, Jobs became ever more excited about it. He had been talking to various companies ranging from Hallmark to Microsoft, about selling Pixar, but watching Woody and Buzz come to life made him realize that he might be on the verge of transforming the movie industry. Jobs decided that the release of Toy Story that November would be the occasion to take Pixar public. I was nervous and argued that we should wait until after our second movie, Lasseter recalled. Steve overruled me and said we needed the cash so we could put up half the money for our films and renegotiate the Disney deal. Was Toy Story a Disney or a Pixar movie? The stakes were raised when Toy Story opened to blockbuster commercial and critical success. The public offering occurred exactly 1 week after Toy Story's opening. Earlier that year, Jobs had been hoping to find a buyer for Pixar that would let him merely recoup the $50 million he had put in. By the end of the day, the shares he had retained, 80% of the company, were worth more than 20 times that, an astonishing $1.2 billion. The successful public stock offering meant that Pixar would no longer have to be dependent on Disney to finance its movies. Jobs flew down to have lunch with Disney CEO Michael Eisner, who was stunned at his audacity. Eisner agreed to let Pixar put up half the money for future films and in return take half of the profits. He didn't think we could have many hits, so he thought he was saving himself some money, said Jobs. Ultimately, that was great for us, because Pixar would have 10 blockbusters in a row. They also agreed on co-branding, though that took a lot of haggling to define. In a letter to Pixar shareholders, Jobs explained that winning the right to have equal branding with Disney on all the movies, as well as advertising and toys, was the most important aspect of the deal. We want Pixar to grow into a brand that embodies the same level of trust as the Disney brand, he wrote. Jobs was known during his career for creating great products, but just as significant was his ability to create great companies with valuable brands, and he created two of the best of his era, Apple and Pixar. The Second Coming. What rough beast, its hour come round at last. Things fall apart. When Jobs unveiled the next computer in 1988, there was a burst of excitement. That fizzled when the computer finally went on sale the following year. Despite his ingrained belief that hardware and software should be integrally linked, he agreed in January 1992 to license the Next Step operating system to run on other computers. A year later, Jobs took the inevitable subsequent step. He gave up making the hardware altogether. By the mid-1990s, Jobs was finding some pleasure in his new family life and his astonishing triumph in the movie business, but he despaired about the personal computer industry. Microsoft dominates with very little innovation. Apple lost. The desktop market has entered the dark ages. Jobs became angry and contemptuous as Scully presided over a steady decline in market share for Apple in the early 1990s. Macintosh lost to Microsoft because Scully insisted on milking all the profits he could get rather than improving the product and making it affordable. As a result, the profits eventually disappeared. During his 1995 Christmas vacation in Kona Village, Hawaii, Jobs went walking along the beach with his friend Larry Ellison, the irrepressible Oracle chairman. They discussed making a takeover bid for Apple and restoring Jobs as its head. But Jobs demurred. "I decided I'm not a hostile takeover kind of guy," he explained. "If they had asked me to come back, it might have been different." By 1996, Apple's share of the market had fallen to 4% from a high of 16% in the late 1980s. Michael Spindler, the German-born chief of Apple's European operations, who had replaced Scully as CEO in 1993, tried to sell the company to Sun, IBM, and Hewlett-Packard. That failed, and he was ousted in February 1996 and replaced by Gil Amelio, a research engineer who was CEO of National Semiconductor. Amelio was not a fan of Jobs. Their first meeting had been in 1994, just after Amelio was elected to the Apple board. Jobs wanted Amelio to help him return to Apple as the CEO. The Macintosh era had passed, Jobs argued, and it was now time for Apple to create something new that was just as innovative. If the Mac is dead, what's going to replace it? Amelio asked. Jobs' reply didn't impress him. Steve didn't seem to have a clear answer, Amelio later said. He shooed Jobs unceremoniously out of his office. By the summer of 1996, Amelio realized that he had a serious problem. Apple was pinning its hopes on creating a new operating system called Copeland, but Amelio had discovered soon after becoming CEO that it was a bloated piece of vaporware that would not solve Apple's needs. So Apple needed a partner, one that could make a stable operating system. There was one company that could obviously supply such software, Next, but it would take a while for Apple to focus on it. Slouching toward Cupertino. Does anyone know Steve well enough to call him on this? Amelio asked his staff. Because his encounter with Jobs 2 years earlier had ended badly, Amelio didn't want to make the call himself. By Thanksgiving of 1996, Apple and Next had begun mid-level talks. Next was failing, and the prospect of being bought by Apple was a tantalizing lifeline. On December 2, 1996, Steve Jobs set foot on Apple's Cupertino campus for the first time since his ouster 11 years earlier. In the executive conference room, he met Amelio and Hancock to make the pitch for Next. It's probably a totally crazy idea, he said, but if they found it appealing, I'll structure any kind of deal you want. License the software, sell you the company, whatever. A few weeks later, Jobs and his family went to Hawaii for Christmas vacation. Larry Ellison was also there, as he had been the year before. You know, Larry, I think I've found a way for me to get back into Apple and get control of it without you having to buy it, Jobs said as they walked along the shore. Ellison recalled, he explained his strategy, which was getting Apple to buy Next, then he would go on the board and be one step away from being CEO. Ellison thought that Jobs was missing a key point. If we don't buy the company, how can we make any money? I think if I went back to Apple and I didn't own any of Apple, and you didn't own any of Apple, I'd have the moral high ground, Jobs replied. Steve, that's really expensive real estate, this moral high ground, said Ellison. Amelio called Jobs to say that he planned to propose to the Apple board that he be authorized to negotiate a purchase of Next. The financial part of the negotiations went smoothly. Apple would buy Next for $400 million. Then Amelio had what turned out to be an uncomfortable task, telling Bill Gates. He went into orbit, Amelio recalled. Gates found it ridiculous, but perhaps not surprising, that Jobs had pulled off this coup. Don't you understand that Steve doesn't know anything about technology? He's just a super salesman. I can't believe you're making such a stupid decision. Gates knew that the deal was destined to bring Jobs back to power. But that was a twist of fate, he said. What they ended up buying was a guy who most people would not have predicted would be a great CEO, because he didn't have much experience at it, But he was a brilliant guy with great design taste and great engineering taste. He suppressed his craziness enough to get himself appointed interim CEO. A few days before the next purchase was due to be announced, Emilio asked Jobs to rejoin Apple full-time and take charge of operating system development. Jobs, however, kept deflecting Emilio's request. Finally, on the day that he was scheduled to make the big announcement, Emilio called Jobs in. He needed an answer. "Steve, do you just want to take your money and leave?" Emilio asked. Finally, Jobs answered, "Look, if you have to tell them something, just say, 'advisor to the chairman.'" And that is what Emilio did. The Restoration. The loser now will be later to win. He returned to Apple officially in January 1997 as a part-time advisor, as he had told Emilio he would. He began to assert himself in some personnel areas, especially in protecting his people who had made the transition from Next. But in most other ways he was unusually passive. "Gil didn't want me around, and I thought he was a bozo. I knew that before I sold him the company. I thought I was just going to be trotted out now and then for events like Macworld, mainly for show. That was fine because I was working at Pixar." Jobs was, in fact, trotted out for Macworld right at the beginning of January, and this reaffirmed his opinion that Emilio was a bozo. Emilio rambled for more than 2 hours before he finally called on stage the person everyone was waiting to cheer. The crowd jumped to its feet and gave him a raucous ovation for more than a minute. The wilderness decade was over. Finally, Jobs waved for silence and cut to the heart of the challenge. "We've got to get the spark back," he said. "The Mac didn't progress much in 10 years, so Windows caught up. So we have to come up with an OS that's even better." Jobs' pep talk could have been a redeeming finale to Emilio's frightening performance. Unfortunately, Emilio came back on stage and resumed his ramblings for another hour. It was only 7 days into the new year for Apple, and already it was clear that the center would not hold. Jobs immediately put people he trusted into the top ranks at Apple. That month, Emilio had to face the annual stockholders meeting and explain why the results for the final quarter of 1996 showed a 30% plummet in sales from the year before. Shareholders lined up at the microphones to vent their anger. Emilio was clueless about how poorly he handled the meeting. "The presentation was regarded as one of the best I had ever given," he later wrote. But Ed Woolard, the former CEO of DuPont who was now the chair of the Apple board, Markkula had been demoted to vice chair, was appalled. "This is a disaster," his wife whispered to him in the midst of the session. Woolard agreed. "Gil came dressed real cool, but he looked and sounded silly," he recalled. "He couldn't answer the questions, didn't know what he was talking about, and didn't inspire any confidence." Woolard picked up the phone and called Jobs, whom he'd never met. The pretext was to invite him to Delaware to speak to DuPont executives. Jobs declined, but as Woolard recalled, the request was a ruse in order to talk to him about Gil. He steered the phone call in that direction and asked Jobs point-blank what his impression of Emilio was. "I thought to myself, I either tell him the truth, that Gil is a bozo, or I lie by omission. I care deeply about Apple, so I just let him have it. I said this guy is the worst CEO I've ever seen. I think if you needed a license to be a CEO, he wouldn't get one." Brent Schlender, Fortune's well-sourced technology reporter, knew Jobs and was familiar with his thinking, and in March he came out with a story detailing the mess. To the Machiavellian eye, it looks as if Jobs, despite the lure of Hollywood — lately he has been overseeing Pixar, maker of Toy Story and other computer-animated films — might be scheming to take over Apple. Once again, Ellison publicly floated the idea of doing a hostile takeover and installing his best friend Jobs as CEO. "Steve's the only one who can save Apple," he told reporters. Jobs was somewhat amused by Ellison's self-appointed role. "Larry brings this up now and then," he told a reporter. "I try to explain my role at Apple is to be an advisor." Emilio, however, was livid. He called Ellison to dress him down, but Ellison wouldn't take the call. So Emilio called Jobs, whose response was equivocal but also partly genuine. "I really don't understand what is going on," he told Emilio. "I think all this is crazy." By then the press had turned against Emilio. Business Week ran a cover asking, "Is Apple mincemeat?" Emilio finally became convinced that Jobs was gunning for him. Steve's plans to manipulate my termination were charging forward. Jobs was indeed bad-mouthing Emilio at every opportunity. He couldn't help himself, but there was a more important factor in turning the board against Emilio. Fred Anderson, the chief financial officer, saw it as his fiduciary duty to keep Ed Woolard and the board informed of Apple's dire situation. "Fred was the guy telling me that cash was draining, people were leaving, and more key players were thinking of it," said Woolard. "He made it clear the ship was going to hit the sand soon, and even he was thinking of leaving." At an executive session of the board in June, with Emilio out of the room, Woolard described to current directors how he calculated their odds. "If we stay with Gil as CEO, I think there's only a 10% chance we will avoid bankruptcy," he said. "If we fire him and convince Steve to come take over, we have a 60% chance of surviving." The board gave him authority to ask Jobs to return. Woolard called Jobs. The board was going to fire Emilio, he said, and it wanted Jobs to come back as CEO. Jobs said no. "I will be an advisor," he said, unpaid. He also agreed to become a board member. That was something he had yearned for, but declined to be the board chairman. Why did Jobs not seize the reins? We'd just taken Pixar public, and I was happy being CEO there. I was enjoying spending more time with my family. I was torn. The claim that he was enjoying spending more time with his family was not convincing. He was frequently aloof from his two younger daughters, estranged again from Lisa, and often prickly as a husband. So what was the real reason for his hesitancy in taking over at Apple? For all of his willfulness and insatiable desire to control things, Jobs was indecisive and reticent when he felt unsure about something. This attitude arose partly out of his tendency to see the world in binary terms. A person was either a hero or a bozo. A product was either amazing or shit. But he could be stymied by things that were more complex, shaded, or nuanced. Getting married, buying the right sofa, committing to run a company. In addition, he didn't want to be set up for failure. Woolard and the board decided to go ahead and fire Emilio, even though Jobs was not yet forthcoming about how active a role he would play as an advisor. At times, Jobs displayed a strange mixture of prickliness and neediness. He usually didn't care one iota what people thought of him. He could cut people off and never care to speak to them again. Yet sometimes he also felt a compulsion to explain himself. So that evening, Emilio received, to his surprise, a phone call from Jobs. "Gee, Gil, I just wanted you to know. I talked to Ed today about this thing, and I really feel bad about it," he said. Take 6 months off, Jobs told him. When I got thrown out of Apple, I immediately went back to work, and I regretted it. He offered to be a sounding board if Emilio ever wanted more advice. Emilio was stunned, but managed to mumble a few words of thanks. He turned to his wife and recounted what Jobs said. In ways, I still like the man, but I don't believe him, he told her. I was totally taken in by Steve, she said, and I really feel like an idiot. Join the crowd, her husband replied. Steve Wozniak, who was himself now an informal advisor to the company, was thrilled that Jobs was coming back. He forgave easily. It was just what we needed, he said, because whatever you think of Steve, he knows how to get the magic back. That Monday, Apple's top employees were summoned to the auditorium. Emilio came in looking calm and relaxed. Well, I'm sad to report that it's time for me to move on, he said. Then, exactly 12 years since he had lost power in a July 4th weekend struggle, Jobs walked back on stage at Apple. It immediately became clear that whether or not he wanted to admit it publicly, or even to himself, Jobs was going to take control and not be a mere advisor. As soon as he came on stage that day, wearing shorts, sneakers, and a black turtleneck, he got to work reinvigorating his beloved institution. Okay, tell me what's wrong with this place, he said. There were some murmurings, but Jobs cut them off. It's the products, he answered. So what's wrong with the products? Again, there were a few attempts at an answer, until Jobs broke in to hand down the correct answer. The products suck, he shouted. There's no sex in them anymore. Instead of declaring victory and thanking the board, Jobs continued to seethe at having to answer to a board he didn't respect. Stop the train. This isn't going to work, he told Woolard. This company is in shambles, and I don't have time to wet nurse the board. So I need all of you to resign, or else I'm going to resign and not come back on Monday. The one person who could stay, he said, was Woolard. After all they'd been through, most were glad to be let off, Woolard recalled. Among those being asked to resign was Mike Markkula, who in 1976, as a young venture capitalist, had visited the Jobs garage, fallen in love with the nascent computer on the workbench, guaranteed a $250,000 line of credit, and become the third partner and one-third owner of the new company. With Jobs returning, he knew that it was time for him to leave. Jobs could be cutting and cold, especially toward people who crossed him, but he could also be sentimental about those who had been with him from the early days. So when the time came to ask him to resign from the Apple board, Jobs drove to Markkula's chateau-like mansion in the Woodside Hills to do it personally. He told me he wanted a new board because he wanted to start fresh, Markkula said. He was worried that I might take it poorly, and he was relieved when I didn't. They spent the rest of the time talking about where Apple should focus in the future. Jobs' ambition was to build a company that would endure, and he asked Markkula what the formula for that would be. Markkula replied that lasting companies know how to reinvent themselves. You've got to reinvent the company to do some other thing, like other consumer products or devices. You've got to be like a butterfly and have a metamorphosis. Jobs didn't say much, but he agreed. Macworld, Boston, August 1997. Indications that Jobs was now deeply engaged at Apple helped push the stock up from about $13 to $20 during July. It also created a frisson of excitement as the Apple faithful gathered for the August 1997 Macworld in Boston. More than 5,000 showed up hours in advance to cram into the Castle Convention Hall of the Park Plaza Hotel for Jobs' keynote speech. They came to see their returning hero and to find out whether he was really ready to lead them again. Huge cheers erupted when a picture of Jobs from 1984 was flashed on the overhead screen. "Steve, Steve, Steve," the crowd started to chant, even as he was still being introduced. When he finally strode on stage, wearing a black vest, collarless white shirt, jeans, and an impish smile, the screams and flashbulbs rivaled those for any rock star. At first, he punctured the excitement by reminding them of where he officially worked. "I'm Steve Jobs, the chairman and CEO of Pixar," he introduced himself, flashing a slide on screen with that title. Then he explained his role at Apple. "I, like a lot of other people, are pulling together to help Apple get healthy again." But as Jobs paced back and forth across the stage, changing the overhead slides with a clicker in his hand, it was clear that he was now in charge at Apple and was likely to remain so. "There are a lot of great people at Apple, but they're doing the wrong things because the plan has been wrong," he said. "I've found people who can't wait to fall into line behind a good strategy, but there just hasn't been one." As he spoke, his passion poured forth with increasing intensity, and he began saying "we" and "I" rather than "they" when referring to what Apple would be doing. "I think you still have to think differently to buy an Apple computer," he said. "The people who buy them do think different. They are the creative spirits in this world, and they're out to change the world. We make tools for those kinds of people." During the prolonged standing ovation, people looked at each other in awe, and a few wiped tears from their eyes. Jobs had made it very clear that he and the "we" of Apple were one. The climax of Jobs' August 1997 Macworld appearance was a bombshell announcement, one that made the cover of both Time and Newsweek. "I'd like to announce one of our first new partnerships today, a very meaningful one, and that is one with Microsoft." The Microsoft and Apple logos appeared together on the screen as people gasped. Apple and Microsoft had been at war for a decade over a variety of copyright and patent issues, most notably whether Microsoft had stolen the look and feel of Apple's graphical user interface. Under Emilio, the showdown had become explosive. Microsoft refused to commit to developing Word and Excel for future Macintosh operating systems, which could have destroyed Apple. In defense of Bill Gates, he was not simply being vindictive. It was understandable that he was reluctant to commit to developing for a future Macintosh operating system when no one, including the ever-changing leadership at Apple, seemed to know what that new operating system would be. When the leadership issue was partly resolved by Emilio's ouster, one of Jobs' first phone calls was to Gates. Jobs recalled, "I called up Bill and said, 'I'm going to turn this thing around.' I said, if we kept up our lawsuits, a few years from now we could win $1 billion patent suit. You know it, and I know it. But Apple's not going to survive that long if we're at war. I know that. So let's figure out how to settle this right away. All I need is a commitment that Microsoft will keep developing for the Mac and an investment by Microsoft in Apple, so it has a stake in our success." When I recounted to him what Jobs said, Gates agreed it was accurate. "We had a group of people who liked working on the Mac stuff, and we liked the Mac," Gates recalled. Although the negotiations went quickly, the final details were not finished until hours before Jobs' Macworld speech in Boston. During his Macworld keynote address, Jobs walked through the details of the Microsoft deal. The audience was beginning to come around, especially when he announced that Microsoft would be investing $150 million in Apple and getting non-voting shares. But the mellower mood was shattered for a moment when Jobs made one of the few visual and public relations gaffes of his onstage career. "I happen to have a special guest with me today, via satellite downlink," he said, and suddenly Bill Gates's face appeared on the huge screen looming over Jobs and the auditorium. There was a thin smile on Gates's face that flirted with being a smirk. The audience gasped in horror, followed by some boos and catcalls. The scene was such a brutal echo of the 1984 Big Brother ad that you half expected and hoped that an athletic woman would suddenly come running down the aisle and vaporize the screen shot with a well-thrown hammer. But it was all for real, and Gates, unaware of the jeering, began speaking on the satellite link from Microsoft headquarters. As he went on to tout the new version of Microsoft Office that was being made for the Macintosh, the audience quieted down and then slowly seemed to accept the new world order. Jobs realized that the image of Gates looming over him and the audience was a mistake. "I wanted him to come to Boston," Jobs later said. "That was my worst and stupidest staging event ever. It was bad because it made me look small, and Apple look small, and as if everything was in Bill's hands." The Microsoft announcement, along with Jobs' passionate re-engagement with the company, provided a much-needed jolt for Apple. By the end of the day, its stock had skyrocketed $6.56, or 33%, to close at $26.31, twice the price of the day Emilio resigned. The one-day jump added $830 million to Apple's stock market capitalization. The company was back from the edge of the grave. Think different. Jobs as CEO. Lee Clow, the creative director at Chiat Day, who had done the great 1984 ad for the launch of the Macintosh, was driving in Los Angeles in early July 1997 when his car phone rang. It was Jobs. "Hi, Lee, this is Steve," he said. "Guess what? Emilio just resigned. Can you come up here?" Clow agreed to fly up to Cupertino with something they could show. Recounting the scene years later, Jobs started to cry. He and his team had come up with this brilliant idea, think different, and it was 10 times better than anything the other agencies showed. It choked me up, and it still makes me cry to think about it, both the fact that Lee cared so much and also how brilliant his think different idea was. Every once in a while, I find myself in the presence of purity of spirit and love, and I always cry. It always just reaches in and grabs me. That was one of those moments. We at Apple had forgotten who we were. One way to remember who you are is to remember who your heroes are. That was the genesis of that campaign. In addition to television commercials, they created one of the most memorable print campaigns in history. Each ad featured a black and white portrait of an iconic historical figure with just the Apple logo and the words "Think Different" in the corner. Making it particularly engaging was that the faces were not captioned. Some of them, Einstein, Gandhi, Lenin, Dylan, Picasso, Edison, Chaplin, King, were easy to identify. But others caused people to pause, puzzle, and maybe ask a friend to put a name to the face. Martha Graham, Ansel Adams, Richard Feynman, Maria Callas, Frank Lloyd Wright, James Watson, Amelia Earhart. Most were Jobs' personal heroes. They tended to be creative people who had taken risks, defied failure, and bet their career on doing things in a different way. He called Eunice Shriver to convince her family to release a picture that he loved of her brother Bobby Kennedy touring Appalachia, and he talked to Jim Henson's children personally to get the right shot of the late Muppeteer. He likewise called Yoko Ono for a picture of her late husband, John Lennon. She sent him one, but it was not Jobs's favorite. Before it ran, I was in New York, and I went to this small Japanese restaurant that I love, and let her know I would be there, he recalled. When he arrived, she came over to his table. "This is a better one," she said, handing him an envelope. "I thought I would see you, so I had this with me." It was the classic photo of her and John in bed together, holding flowers, and it was the one that Apple ended up using. Different ad. Jobs did some different thinking of his own. On September 16, 1997, Jobs decided that he would officially take over running the company, at least on a temporary basis. He took no salary and signed no contract, but he was not tentative in his actions. He was in charge, and he did not rule by consensus. By December, it had become clear that Jobs's ICEO status had evolved from interim to indefinite. The problem Jobs faced was that running two companies was brutal. Looking back on it, he traced his health problems back to those days. "It was rough, really rough, the worst time in my life. I had a young family, I had Pixar, I would go to work at 7 a.m. and I'd get back at 9 at night, and the kids would be in bed. And I couldn't speak. I literally couldn't. I was so exhausted. I couldn't speak to Laureen. All I could do was watch a half hour of TV and vegetate. It got close to killing me." Despite the grueling schedule, the more that Jobs immersed himself in Apple, the more he realized that he would not be able to walk away. "I discovered that the best innovation is sometimes the company, the way you organize a company," he recalled. "The whole notion of how you build a company is fascinating. When I got the chance to come back to Apple, I realized that I would be useless without the company, and that's why I decided to stay and rebuild it." Killing the clones. One of the great debates about Apple was whether it should have licensed its operating system more aggressively to other computer makers, the way Microsoft licensed Windows. Apple resisted licensing out the Macintosh operating system until 1994. Apple got an $80 licensing fee for each computer sold, but instead of expanding the market, the cloners cannibalized the sales of Apple's own high-end computers, on which it made up to $500 in profit. Jobs's objections to the cloning program were not just economic, however. One of his core principles was that hardware and software should be tightly integrated. He telephoned Ed Woolard to say he was getting Apple out of the licensing business. The board acquiesced. "It was the dumbest thing in the world to let companies making crappier hardware use our operating system and cut into our sales," he later said. Product line review. One of Jobs's great strengths was knowing how to focus. "Deciding what not to do is as important as deciding what to do," he said. "That's true for companies, and it's true for products." The company was churning out multiple versions of each product because of bureaucratic momentum and to satisfy the whims of retailers. Jobs finally began asking simple questions like, "Which ones do I tell my friends to buy?" When he couldn't get simple answers, he began slashing away at models and products. Soon he had cut 70% of them. "You are bright people," he told one group. "You shouldn't be wasting your time on such crappy products." Many of the engineers were infuriated at his slash and burn tactics, which resulted in massive layoffs. After a few weeks, Jobs finally had enough. "Stop," he shouted at one big product strategy session. "This is crazy." He grabbed a magic marker, padded to a whiteboard, and drew a horizontal and vertical line to make a four-squared chart. "Here's what we need," he continued. Atop the two columns, he wrote Consumer and Pro. He labeled the two rows Desktop and Portable. Their job, he said, was to make 4 great products, one for each quadrant. The result was that the Apple engineers and managers suddenly became sharply focused on just 4 areas. For the professional desktop quadrant, they would work on making the Power Macintosh G3. For the professional portable, there would be the PowerBook G3. For the consumer desktop, work would begin on what became the iMac. And for the consumer portable, they would focus on what would become the iBook. The I, Jobs later explained, was to emphasize that the devices would be seamlessly integrated with the Internet. This ability to focus saved Apple. In his first year back, Jobs laid off more than 3,000 people, which salvaged the company's balance sheets. For the fiscal year that ended when Jobs became interim CEO in September 1997, Apple lost $1.04 billion. We were less than 90 days from being insolvent.